Morning, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about the science and our recent stock assessment for the West Coast Demersal resource. My role now is actually as principal scientist for demersal resources across the state, having spent the last sort of 14 years just in the West Coast Demersal resource. So it's a new role for me, but in replacement for the West Coast Demersal, my previous West Coast Demersal role, we now have Emily Fisher, who's joined us. Well, has been with the department for quite a long time, but has moved into the West Coast Demersal role. So from here on, that's your point of contact if you're interested in scientific outputs when it comes to West Coast Demersal specifically. But today I'll just run through our last stock assessment that we completed at the end of last year. And I'm just going to share this screen with you. If you could just let me know that with the verbal that's actually up and running, because I can't see any of you anymore, unfortunately. So
it's running, Dave.
Great.
That's good, Dave.
Thank you. So yeah, just as Clint mentioned, it'd be good if you could leave your questions to the end, because I can't actually see any of you when I'm on this PowerPoint presentation mode, so I won't know if you've put a hand up or not. Anyway, so yeah, as Clinton mentioned, there's quite a bit more detail on this stock assessment report on the website, and I'll give you a link a little bit later on, but this is basically a summary of the key outcomes that I'll run through today. And if you want some more detail, there's a really comprehensive report and corresponding information on our website. So, as you well know, the West Coast Demersal Scalefish resource comprises all of the demersal species along the west coast, from north of Kalbarri to just east of Augusta. And there's anything from 100 or more species landed by both the rec and the commercial sectors in any one year across that whole bioregion. So it's a pretty diverse resource and a pretty big fishery. But yeah, primarily the catches are just comprised of just a few species. So the rec catch is primarily dhufish, snapper, Balton groper and breaksea cod. And the commercial catch similarly is primarily dhufish and snapper, but also there are catches of red throat, bite redfish and also Balton groper. But as far as the monitoring and assessment of this resource goes, because it is such a big resource, it's a large area to cover. So we look at catches of the whole of the resource. That's all species across the whole bioregion and in each of these primary management areas that you can see on the map here. And we collate data from the recreational sector through the integrated survey of private recreational boat fishers, and also from the commercial and charter fishers like yourselves via the logbook systems that you contribute to. And then we also run stock assessments of the key indicator species, and we look at catches and also biological stock status. And what I mean by indicator species, and we're talking about dhufish and snapper here, these are key species in the fishery. They're important to both sectors, so they're socially and also economically important, but they're also quite susceptible to the effects of fishing. And that's because, snapper and dhufish can reach around 40 years of age, and they have a range of other biological characteristics which make them somewhat vulnerable. So, as you would know, Coburn Sound is an area where pink snapper aggregates to spawn. And so also there is specific management to really try and maintain those aggregations and look after them and make sure they're contributing to future generations of snapper stocks. So there are a range of things that make them vulnerable to the effects of fishing. Over time, we've done quite a lot of work on dhufish and snapper in particular, and the whole of the demersal resource. So back in the mid-90s, some of the biological studies first were conducted on dhufish, and then in the early 2000s on snapper. But then the first major stock assessment of these species in this resource wasn't conducted until the early 2000s and was delivered in 2007. And you may recall that first assessment identified that overfishing had been occurring for these key species and therefore this resource. And so a whole range of changes were made to the management of the fishery, as you would be aware, to recover that resource. And so, we're talking about, say, the demersal closure for the recreational sector between October and December, changes to bag limits and boat limits introduced for dhufish. And then the commercial sector is now a limited entry fishery, and each fisher has a limited number of hours that they can fish in any one year. So there's a range of management tools there to limit catch for this resource to allow the recovery to occur. And the initial intention was for the recovery to occur over a 20-year period. And that's the sort of time frame that it takes for species with the sort of biology that dhufish and snapper have to actually recover back to what is a sustainable level. So since the management changes were made and completed by early 2010, we've been conducting stock assessments roughly every 3 years. We first conducted an assessment in 2014, which was only a few years after management changes were made and therefore not likely to show a great deal of change at that time, given the time frame it takes for recovery to occur. So there wasn't a lot seen there, but by 2017 we started to see some recovery of these species, but only in parts of the bioregion and only for certain species. So it wasn't an across the board recovery that was going on. And one of the big questions raised was, is there an issue around release mortality? And that was primarily because there were pretty high release rates coming through for dhufish and snapper through the recreational sector. So in the order of 60 odd to 70 odd % of dhufish and snapper being caught were being released. And as we know, these sorts of species can suffer post-release mortality. We know dhufish experiences barotrauma, particularly when it's in deeper water. And so does snapper to an extent, but it's a little bit tougher than dhufish, obviously. But there are also other reasons why fish die post-release or even pre-capture. You know, you've got depredation questions, which has been quite a hot topic in recent years. Other things like handling and gut hooking and things like that can also cause that release mortality that we see. So we did a bit of work to evaluate release mortality on these species because we were conscious of this being a potential issue and really needed to be considering how we might incorporate it in stock assessments. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes and talk a little bit more about release mortality. So moving on to 2021, we've just completed what's called a level 5 assessment. It's a very large assessment, it's complex and it has lots of different levels of analyses, and I'll talk about that in more detail now. So the first sort of simple information and analyses is basically looking at catch and effort over time, and that's of all species in the resource and for both sectors, so the commercial and the recreational sectors. And bearing in mind that what we charter fishing is typically, or is currently, sort of considered part of the recreational sector. So when I'm talking about sectors, I'm talking about private recreational boats and charter fishers as being the recreational sector. And also we conduct what's called weight of evidence assessments for our key indicator species, which are dhufish and snapper. And they range in complexity and levels of analysis. So for example, level 1 type analyses are fairly simple analyses of catch. And we're really interested in how catches trend over time and how they compare to what are called catch recovery benchmarks. And these are basically limits on catch. We're trying to ensure that catches remain below these benchmarks over this 20-year recovery period so that stocks can recover. We then do some more complex analyses on biological data that we collect, and particularly age composition information, and from that estimate rates of fishing mortality, and I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more in detail. And then level 5 analyses, which are the most complex of all these types of analyses, are where we incorporate all of the information that we have into models of relative biomass. So we can try and track the relative biomass over time and how that might relate to what is considered sustainable levels. So firstly, just looking then at the overall catch of the resource, all species combined. So on the left here, we have a graph of the catches of the recreational sector, and you can see the catches of the charter vessels in the small black bars, which have been provided since 2001-2 via the logbook system. So we have annual data for the charter vessels in the West Coast bioregion. And then for the private recreational fishers, we have periodic surveys, which have been conducted typically every 2 to 3 years over time. And so the key thing here is that, so post-management changes, which were completed around 2010 or early 2010, the total catch of both private and charter vessels had declined quite dramatically following the management changes. But then over time started to increase. So by 2017-18, the total catch had increased up to around 292 tonnes from private plus charter vessels. We've recently conducted another survey of the recreational boats, and the results of that will be completed sometime this year. And as you can see, obviously since 2017-18, when we last had an estimate of both charter and private boats, you can see obviously charter catches have declined quite a bit, and no doubt COVID is partly to blame for that, having influenced charter fishers' ability to actually get out fishing and take clients out, particularly during lockdowns in 2020. Then you move over to the right-hand side there, the graph on the right is the catch of the commercial sector over time. And the two primary fisheries that catch demersal fish in the West Coast bioregion are your wetline fishery and also the gillnet longline fishery. And you can see, just roughly speaking, that around about 10% of the catch is taken by gillnet longline. So the primary fishery really is the commercial line fishery, the wetline fishery. So post 2010, post 2008, which is when the primary changes were made to this fishery, the commercial line fishery became a limited entry fishery. The total catches since 2008 were dramatically reduced from previous years, and you can see them tracking along at relatively consistent levels over time. There was a gradual increase in the first sort of 5 or 6 years of the fishery, and that was owing to changes in or increases in catches of snapper by the commercial fishers due to a strong cohort joining the population and joining the fishery. So catches and catch rates were increasing gradually. So a range of management changes were made to the entitlements, or the number of hours that fishers could fish, to reduce their catches and keep them below the catch recovery benchmarks. And that was quite successful. And so you can see since about 2015, that total catches have been maintained at lower levels than they were in the first few years of the fishery. We then move on to dhufish in particular. And so this graph shows you the total catch of the commercial plus the recreational sector against a recovery benchmark of 225 tonnes. So this is the total catch, or total fishing mortality, I should say, for this species to allow stocks to recover. And so when I say total fishing mortality, it comprises what's known as the retained catch. So that's the reported catch that we have through surveys and logbooks, plus an estimate of release mortality, as I talked about earlier. And that comes from information that we get through the integrated survey and also through charter logbooks as you guys report the released fish, or the numbers of released fish. Multiply that by an average weight of released fish, and we've obtained that through the recreational angler logbook program. We know that the vast majority of fish released are undersized through the integrated surveys that were conducted on recreational fishing. And so the typical average weight of dhufish is around about 1.4 kilos for about a 44 centimetre fish, and that's what's used in that average weight in this calculation. The 50% release mortality estimate, that as in what we're saying is about 50% of dhufish die post-release, is a product of all of the information and all of the types of mortality that are occurring. So it's barotrauma caused, it's gut hooking, it's handling, and it's depredation. It's all of those things combined. And the information for that comes from previous studies that have been conducted on dhufish. So we know that, for example, more dhufish die as you go deeper as a function of barotrauma. So we're using the existing information that we have on release mortality to estimate a total tonnage of release mortality that occurs in the fishery. So what you can see from this figure when you add retained catch and release mortality together is that total fishing mortality over time has been maintained below the recovery benchmark. So that's a good thing. In the grand scheme, we're keeping catches down to an appropriate level. When we move on to snapper, you can see that since 2009-10, that total fishing mortality, which is your retained catch plus your post-release mortality, has been increasing over time, or did increase over time until about 2013-14. And around about 2015 was when changes were made to entitlements for the commercial fishers to reduce their snapper catch, because snapper catches were above their recovery benchmark, but also recreational catches had been increasing as well. So the total catch from the rec and the commercial sectors of snapper was increasing substantially. And so changes that were made to management have brought the total catch, or total fishing mortality, down and back below the recovery benchmark to allow the stocks to recover. So if we now move on to the biological information that we collect, over the last 10 or so years, we've been collecting frames through both the recreational and the commercial sectors to monitor changes in the population over time. Basically, we collect 300 to 500 frames if we can from each of the management areas for both snapper and dhufish, and from each of the sectors, so that we have a diverse array of samples. We have a very spatially diverse sample, so it's right across the West Coast bioregion, and we also collect it from many different fishes. So in the last 10 or so years, we've had about 3,000 or more recreational fishers donate frames to the department through our Centres of Skeletons program, and that's amounted to over 18,000 frames over that 10 or so years. So it's been a really impressive program as far as a monitoring program goes, and the sheer volume of frames that we get ensures that we have a really good data set to look at to monitor how these populations are recovering over time. And so one of the key things we're after out of each frame is the ear bone or otolith, because you may well know that otoliths have growth rings on them. They're much like growth rings on a tree, and we can count them up to determine how old a particular fish was. And from that, we can build up what's called an age composition, or basically a picture of the relative numbers of fish in each age group in the population. So this graph here just shows you across the bottom axis, you've got the age in years, and up the left axis there, you've got the frequency, which is the number of fish in each of the age groups. And this graph can tell us a couple of different things. So one thing is, do we have old fish in the population? So we know that dhufish and snapper can reach 40 years of age. So it's important to have fish extending out into the 30 odd years of age group. And although they're going to be less abundant, they're still an important part of the population. The other sort of information we can get from this figure is this slope. So basically we're interested in what happens, how steep is that slope from the top of the graph, this most abundant age group, down to the bottom of the graph, wherever this oldest age group is on the graph. And that slope tells us a lot about the rate of mortality in this population. So firstly, just looking at dhufish and the age compositions, and I'll come back to what this means in terms of fishing mortality and total mortality. When we look at the age distributions for dhufish in the northern part of the West Coast, which is your Midwest areas and your Kalbarri areas, back in the mid-90s, what you can see is we had a range of fish above 20 years of age in the population and a couple above 30. The vast majority is in your 5 to 15 and even up to 20-year age group. And obviously that's a natural picture that you would see in a population, but what you should also see is this number of older fish in the population being present. When you move forward to 2009-11, which is about when the management changes are being made, what you see is, again, you have a large component of younger fish, which you should have. But once you get past 20, there's very few fish in that age distribution, indicating that over time we appear to have lost a component of the population, which is those older fish. Move forward to 2015 to 17-18, you can see that it actually looks dramatically worse. There are really no fish above 20 years of age. The vast majority of fish are between about 5 and 15. And the key thing about this is that what's happening when you're losing these older fish in the population is these young fish don't survive for long enough to actually replenish the population over time. So they have this long lifespan in order to produce eggs and new recruits to the population for many years in a row. But if they only live for a few years, then they don't really get that opportunity. So the key thing in these long-lived species is to have this tail of older fish in the population. That demonstrates fish are surviving for a reasonable period of time, and you have a more sustainable population. So when we then look at the southern part of the West Coast, which is your metropolitan and southwest areas, similarly to the northern part of the West Coast, you can see back in the mid-90s that there were a smattering of older fish in the population through the 20 to 30 odd year age groups. Moving forward to 2009 to 10-11, we still have a reasonable number of fish between 20 and 30 years of age. It's not dissimilar to what it was like in the mid-90s. It is dominated by younger fish, but that's normal. And the other key thing you see here is that we have these quite strong peaks through the age distribution, and that's a function of the way dhufish and also snapper recruit to the population. They'll have good years and not so good years. So you'll see these peaks and troughs in your age distributions, down, up, down, over time. We then move forward to 2015 through to 17, 18. There's still some of those fish in the 20 plus age groups. So we don't appear to be really losing a lot of those older fish in that part of the West Coast, which is a good thing. I will just point out though that the vast majority of those older fish are really in the southwest area, not as much in the metropolitan area. But one of the other things to note is that an old fish is not necessarily a large fish. So if you catch a large fish, it doesn't mean it's an old fish. It hasn't necessarily lived a long time. It might only be 8 to 9, 10 years of age rather than 20 or 30 years of age. So coming back to that idea of the slope and how steep it might be. So just quickly looking at the graph at the top right here, we're looking at this slope and how steep it is from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph. And we're ideally looking for a situation where that slope is relatively slight and it goes right out here because of the fact that you have older fish in the population. Now, given what I've just told you, that's not necessarily the case for dhufish in the West Coast. So this graph just shows you what those slopes effectively are. So over time, looking at the black points, they represent the fishing mortality at the whole of the bioregion level. And you can see it bouncing around over time, but it has been above what's called this limit reference point, this dashed line here, for quite some time. It has declined in recent years. The limit reference point and the threshold reference point, these are internationally accepted reference points, particular for these sorts of species and their biology and given they're long-lived. So what we know is that for a species like dhufish to be sustainable, fishing mortality levels need to be below what's called the threshold reference point, which is down here somewhere. Then you know you're not fishing at too high a rate for it to be able to replenish its population. So just pointing out that we're still above the limit reference point at that last estimate. We need to be below the threshold reference point. So we've got a fair way to go when it comes to this species. But when you split it by north and south, so we look at the fishing mortality rates in the northern part of the West Coast, you can see they're obviously much higher than in the south. And that's owing to that age distribution information that I just showed you. What's happened over time is we've sort of lost the older fish in the population, and so that slope has increased. So that value there has been increasing. We're well above the limit reference point, which is not where we want to be. When you look at the south and thinking again about that age composition, the fishing mortality rate is much lower than in the north, and that's good. It also appears to have declined slightly between the last couple of estimates, so that it's between the limit and threshold reference point. We're still working towards it getting below the threshold reference point. Moving on to snapper, you can see there for this graph here, this is snapper age distributions from the early 2000s when we first started collecting snapper for the northern part of the West Coast. So that's your Midwestern Kalbarri areas again. And you can see that unlike dhufish back in the earlier days, there are really no older fish in this population at all. The snapper age distribution and population is dominated by really young fish of only around 4 or 5 years of age. So what that's saying is you haven't got the fish living for multiple years and replenishing the population. They're only there for 1 or 2 years before they're caught and removed. So that effectively means that that part of the population at the time was really teetering on the edge of collapse. You move forward to 2009, 10, 11, the age distribution is still dominated by your young fish, definitely below 10 years of age. There are some fish in that 10 to 20 year age group, so that's good to know that there's some older fish there. Important, therefore, from then on, that the fishing mortality remains low enough so that that age distribution can continue to fill out. So we're really looking for these fish to start extending out to 20 to 30 and above 30. And so when you move forward to 2015 to 17, 18, you do actually start to see that happening. There is a greater relative frequency of fish in this 10 to 20 year age group and a few just above the 20 year age group. So that's a good thing. It looks like there's some evidence of recovery occurring there in that part of the population. So then when you move to the southern part of the West Coast, it's not a dissimilar picture to what the North looked like back in the early 2000s, where there really are very few older fish in that part of the population. Move forward to 2009, 10, 11. Again, there's not a lot above 20 years of age. There are some fish surviving through to 10 plus years of age, but we're really looking for this tail to continue out here. So when you move through to 2015, 17 and 18, there are some of those older fish, relatively not very abundant, and the vast majority are still in that sort of 5 through to 10, 11, 12 years of age. So it actually appears, relatively speaking, we've lost a few of those fish between the 10 to 20 year age group from 2009, 10, 11 through to the most recent age distributions that we have. And so all that information is reflected in these fishing mortality rates that I was showing you for dhufish. So again, at the bioregion level, which is your black points, not surprising that back in the early 2000s, that fishing mortality rate was very high, given the age distributions had no old fish in them. But with a slight improvement in the numbers of old fish, it has declined at the bioregion level and is heading downwards, but still above the limit reference point. And in fact, in the last two estimates, it hasn't really changed much at all, hovering above that limit reference point. So then, much like dhufish, if you split it by north and south, the north indicates that the age distribution there has fewer older fish than in the south, so the fishing mortality rate is higher and above the limit reference point. Whereas you move to the south and you can see that it's definitely lower and it's somewhere between the limit and the threshold reference point. But just point out that hasn't really changed a great deal in those last three estimates over time. That's sort of just hovering around. It's not making a unidirectional trajectory below or down to below the threshold reference point at this point in time. Okay, so just moving on then to what we call level 5 integrated models of biomass. So these are what we call basically population models. They incorporate all of the information that we have. But when you think about it simplistically, a population model is a function of things like recruitment and growth. So a population can increase when new recruits join the population. So you get new juveniles joining the population every year through spawning. And then those fish grow, so they increase in size, and that increases your biomass. But at the same time, you've also got mortality going on. So that might be natural mortality, which is just from things like old age or disease and predation, for example. But also you've got on top of that fishing mortality, which is also going to bring your population biomass down. So it is a little bit more complex than that in terms of these models and how they're constructed, but that's the sort of simple concept of a model. You've got this balancing act between population increase and population decrease. And what we're trying to do over time is monitor how that biomass changes and whether and where it is in relation to internationally accepted reference points, which are these three dotted lines here. So the red line is your limit reference point. You don't want to fall below that. That's when you're getting to the point where your population is so small, there is the potential for collapse. But you do want to be above this threshold reference point, which is your orange dotted line. You need the biomass to be at least above there for it to be considered a sustainable population. But ideally, if you want abundance and lots of fish, then you want to be above this target reference point. And so just as I mentioned quickly, the models themselves incorporate a whole range of different information that we have, and that's from information on catch and also catch rate, which provides us an index of abundance over time. We have information on the biology of the species, which might be the age at which they mature, at what age are they selected by gear and retained by fishing gear, how do they grow and does that change over time? The age frequency distribution information that I just showed you earlier, which also gives us information on recruitment and how that changes over time. And then also post-release mortality, that sort of question about additional mortality over and above retained catch. So firstly, just looking at dhufish, this graph on the left here is your relative biomass from this integrated model over time for the whole of the West Coast bioregion. So you can see the relative biomass, that's basically your little white dot in the middle there, declining over time through until around 2010. So at that point in time, we'd fallen below the limit reference point, which, as I mentioned, is when your population is getting to such a low point that it could collapse. And at that point in time is when the management changes were made, and what you can see there is that basically they've halted or arrested the decline in biomass. So the management changes made were having an effect to ensure that biomass didn't continue to decline at that whole of bioregional level. And in fact, it's actually started to increase in that last 10-year period. It did slow down in the last few years, but by 2020, we have reached a point where we're somewhere between the limit and threshold reference point. So we, as I mentioned, we need to get above that orange dotted line, but ideally above that green dotted line. So still a bit of work to do there. But when you split it by north and south, so this is the graph on the right-hand side. The blue line is your relative biomass in the south, and the black line is your relative biomass in the north. And you can see the obvious difference. So following the initial decline, it ended up that the relative biomass in the south was better off than it was in the north. And so by 2010, when the management changes were made or completed, we'd pretty much hit the limit reference point in the south. But for the north, that relative biomass had already declined well below the limit reference point. Post management changes again, like the whole of bioregion level, we've arrested that decline, and it's started to increase slightly depending on which part of the bioregion you're in. So in the north, it has increased, but it's still pretty much around that limit reference point, whereas in the south, it's increased and it's up around that threshold reference point. Move on to Snapper. It's a similar story in terms of the bioregional level. Initially, that we had big decline in relative biomass through to around 2010. And then when the management changes were made, we pretty much halted that decline, broadly speaking, but the only issue is that relative biomass hasn't changed greatly since management changes were made. So we're 10 years into a 20-year recovery period, and we haven't really cracked the limit reference point yet, which is a bit of an issue. So when you split it by north and south, you can see that in fact, once management changes were made and we sort of halted that decline, there is some improvement in the south, but it's pretty slow. And it's only just around that limit reference point by 2020. In the north, it actually declined a little bit further, and that's owing to those high catches I was talking about earlier. We had quite high commercial catch in the northern part of the west coast, and that sort of held that relative biomass down, stopped it recovering. So by 2020, you're really still under the limit reference point. So just to summarise the information I've shown you today, basically the age composition information I showed you is that we still don't really have enough old fish in the population. We really need a greater frequency of fish above that 15 years of age for both snapper and dhufish. And as I mentioned, that's really critical to ensure that the population can actually replenish itself consistently over time. The relative biomass information that I showed you is not increasing sufficiently for both species, so particularly in the north for dhufish, but in both areas for snapper. So what it's really saying is that although we saw those total catch or fishing mortality figures that I showed you earlier, where they were below the recovery benchmark, it appears that basically that level of fishing mortality is not sufficiently low enough to recover these populations at the appropriate rate that was initially planned based on the management changes that were made in 2010. So I'll leave it there as far as summarising the stock assessment today, and just to remind you that, yeah, we do have quite a bit of detail on the website. There is the primary stock assessment report, which you can find on there as a PDF, so it's downloadable. There's a hell of a lot of detail in there, so it's well worth a look. There's much more fine scale detail for charter fishers, so if you want to get more information on catches in different areas and that kind of thing, then that sort of detail is in this report. As there is in the statewide survey of boat-based rec fishing, there's much more information there on what goes on in the private boat-based fishers' catch and effort. And then annually we produce the State of the Fisheries report, which you may have seen before, but that will give you, if you're interested, annual updates on charter catch that you can look at. And also we do contribute to what's called a national stock status reporting that's conducted every 2 to 3 years, which really just replicates the information that you can find on our website, but it's quite easy to read. So I will leave it there, and by all means drop me a line. My email address is there on the page, and just wanted to say thanks for joining in today.